What are the things that cruise lines are doing to improve the environmental impact of cruising? I'm Gary Bembridge. This is another of my tips for travelers. There's no doubt that people, travelers everywhere, are becoming more and more concerned about the environmental impact of travel, whether it's buses, whether it's trains, whether it's flights, and importantly, of course, whether it's cruising. Cruising is growing, it's becoming more popular, it's not going away. So what are the cruise lines doing to address the environmental impact of ships cruising all around the world? There are 6 critical things that they are doing, starting with this one. The most important area that cruise lines are focusing on to reduce the issue of environmental impact is in the area of carbon emissions, where the goal is to reduce carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. And they're doing that by using a whole range of things that were not even possible 10 years ago and some even 5 years ago. First of all, one of the most well-known things is they use scrubbers. Scrubbers are devices which attempt to take out most of the bad things that are emitted through burning fossil fuel. So things like sulfur and particle matter. 60% of cruise ships today currently use scrubbers, and they can reduce sulfur by 98%, particle matter by 50%. There was some controversy around scrubbers for a period of time because the process which uses water, some of that was being released into the ocean, which is now largely not done by cruise ships because of the potential knock-on effect to the marine pollution. The second thing, which is one of the most significant changes, is the change in fuels that they're using. And there's a big drive to move to LNG, which is liquefied natural gas. So that's still a fossil fuel, but it is a dramatically better fossil fuel. It has no dust, it has no soot, it has no particles, and it can reduce sulfur emissions by another 99%, so almost entirely, and it can dramatically reduce nitrogen oxide emissions by up to 85% compared to current fuels. 2 ships at the time of recording are already in service using LNG, and there's 26 on order, and a lot of the new ships now being ordered by the big corporations, so Carnival Corporation, Royal Caribbean, for example. Most of those new ships are LNG ships, and they're using them across all of their brands. This is seen as one of the most significant and biggest changes, is the change to LNG. That's going to have a massive impact on carbon emissions. However, there is another thing that people are doing with fossil fuels, and that's using ultra low sulfur fuel. So these are available. They were largely used in very sensitive areas. So they might be used in some of the Arctic areas, sometimes in Alaska, and sometimes up in the Norwegian fjords. Some cruise lines are starting to only use these fuels. So I guess they're more expensive, which is what's holding people back. But if you take Hapag-Lloyd, for example, the German-based cruise line, which is ultra luxury, from 2020, they will only use ultra low sulfur fuels across their entire fleet. So that is another way that cruise lines are starting to address it. So LNG is the big push, at ultra low sulfur or marine oil is the other. There are 2 other really interesting innovations. Hurtigruten, for example, at the time of recording has just launched a dual fuel system which uses battery power and marine oil. So dual fuel, a bit like cars increasingly using both electric and petrol. That's a big initiative. The other thing which Hurtigruten are doing, which is very interesting, is moving to biofuel. So this is looking at using natural products, so for example, the waste from the fish industry, to turn those into fuel to motor their ships. So you've got dual fuel and increasingly biofuel being used by some cruise lines. The 5th bunch of technology that cruise lines are using is a really interesting one, and this is through the use of very special paints on the hull, but also technology which I think was originally introduced by Royal Caribbean, which blows bubbles along the hull to reduce the drag, and that makes a huge difference in the amount of fuel that's burnt because the ships can move much more efficiently through. So there's lots of technology around the design of the hulls and how you can make the hulls more streamlined through bubble technology, paint technology, to make the ships just more efficient and burn less fuel. The 6th area is a really important one, and it's particularly around port. So if ships are in port all day, which they normally are, they are, of course, if they're using fossil fuels, burning and having emissions. So what the move is to move to ships literally plugging in to shoreside. So at the moment it's relatively restricted, but increasingly ships are being developed or converted so they can actually plug into the electric system and electric grid in the ports. At the time of recording, there were 30% of cruise ships fitted with this capability, and there was a whole bunch, about 20% being refitted, and almost all of the new ships that are being built are fitted with these new systems. So plug-in power imports is a key way of improving the air quality in port towns. So those are the 6 ways that cruise lines are focusing on the most important issue of reducing carbon emissions. The second area that cruise lines are focusing on to reduce their environmental impact is one that gets the most publicity in practice, and that's the reduction of single-use plastics, like so many people are trying to do generally. Manufacturers and people around the world are trying to reduce single-use plastics. Most cruise lines have now moved away from using straws. Either you have to ask for a straw, or increasingly they're moving to recyclable or straws that can be basically combustible. So that's the most visible thing, the thing gets talked about the most. But most cruise lines are also removing things like the little small toiletry bottles that you get to have big refillable bottles or pump dispensers. They're also doing things like getting rid of water bottles. So plastic water bottles used to be given when you went on excursions or in your room. They're replacing them with glass bottles or refillable bottles, and they're providing their own water, which they're making on board, sometimes partnering with various eco water generating systems. So try to get rid of lots of plastic bottles. The stats when you hear how many plastic bottles were used in cruise ships is quite staggering. So they're starting to get rid of some of those things in the customer facing areas. So for example, on the most recent cruise I was on Oceania, you don't get little plastic lids anymore on the cups, wooden stirrers, not plastic stirrers. So all those customer facing things, but also what they're trying to do in the supply chain, like many manufacturers and supermarkets are doing, is getting rid of as much single-use plastics as possible. Of course, because plastic in the ocean is a huge issue, and it's something that the industry is trying to really get rid of, single-use plastics. The third area that cruise lines are focusing on to improve their environmental impact is in the area of recycling. Now, for quite a long time, cruise ships have been pretty good on the recycling area, but they have become even more aggressive. On board every single cruise ship, you'll have an environmental officer. And if you're on a cruise, I recommend you actually try and meet with them or go on the tours that they run. It's claimed that a cruise ship will do 60 to 80% more recycling than a person will do at home. And everything on the ship is really sorted and structured, because bear in mind, if you're on a cruise ship, they have to do something with it. So what they do now is they collect all the glass, they sort the glass, the cardboard, the paper, and they basically then sort that and package it up, grind it down, and when they head into port, they sell it on or move it on to recycling. So there's a lot of recycling going on board the cruise ship. And of course, because they have to do it because of all the regulations about what you can and can't put in the ocean, they have become very regimented at recycling. The fifth area is around water. So bear in mind that cruise ships are actually allowed to dispose of treated water into the ocean if there's certain speed and distance out. Also, if you process sewage, the same thing applies. They have to treat sewage to a very high level before it can be released into the ocean. Now, that is not a maritime law, that is a Cruise Line Association rule. But what cruise lines have done is they've moved to really advanced water processing systems. So they're able to generate water, process water, treat water, so it's very high grade before they put it into the ocean. In some cases, of course, it is also offloaded in port, but they basically treat the water to a very high level, so when it goes back into the ocean, it is not going to cause any damage within the ocean. And this is something that's become very regulated and strong rules within the Cruise Line Association. So advanced water systems have now been rolled out on many, many ships, and all new ships have that whole process. The sixth area that cruise lines are focusing on is one that I think probably personally, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And this is the whole area of responsible and over tourism. Anyone who's been on a cruise, particularly some parts of Europe or the Caribbean, will know that the towns and places can be extremely overrun by travelers, whether it's from big cruise ships or even on river cruises. So lots of cruises are pouring out into places that can't really cope. And the industry is starting to do more and more work around over-tourism. So they're working, for example, with the mayor of Dubrovnik, they're working with the Venice authorities, because that's a place that gets really overrun, places like Santorini, to look at how the cruise ships can arrive, stagger times, different times, try and get travelers who are on cruises to sort of head out from the obvious places and spread both the impact and the money further out into the country and the areas that they're traveling in. It's an area that I think needs a lot more work, but certainly something that the Cruise Line Association is understanding they need to do much more work on. The one thing they are doing, and we're seeing quite a lot of progress on, is partnering with big, important organizations to basically make more of an impact. So for example, some of the ones that are worth noting are as follows. The Carnival Corporation, they support the Nature's Conservation's Mapping Ocean Wealth Program. Seabourn have a partnership with UNESCO, which helps invest in heritage sites, World Heritage sites, and responsible tourism around those sites. Royal Caribbean has a partnership with the World Wildlife Fund to try and help educate the cruiser and also help fund programs to support wildlife and the environment and nature. And MSC Cruises partners with Mare Vio, which is an Italian marine conservation association. So whilst I think there's progress being made, I think there's a lot of work to be done over the next couple of years by the cruise industry to really focus on the area of environmental impact and over-tourism. Cruising, of course, does have a big impact on the environment, like many forms of transportation do. The cruise industry know that they have to address that and become better at doing it. So those are the 6 things that they're currently doing to try and improve the impact they have on the environment. I have many more cruise tips for travelers, so why don't you watch another one of those videos right now?